Dr. Nathan Bryan is a renowned expert in nitric oxide biochemistry with over 20 years of research and numerous patents in the field. He's the founder and CEO of Bryan Therapeutics, focusing on developing nitric oxide based therapies for chronic conditions like heart disease and diabetes. Discover what sparked his interest in nitric oxide research and how this fascinating molecule impacts metabolic health, particularly for individuals with diabetes. Dr. Nathan shares his significant discoveries and patents, shedding light on how they've revolutionized diabetes management and working to improve patient care. Stay tuned. Dr. Nathan Bryan is an international expert in nitric biochemistry and molecular medicine. His more than 20 years in academic research led to many seminal discoveries and has resulted in dozens of issued U.S. and international patents. Products from his innovations are the most successful nitric oxide products in the market and responsible for hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue around the globe and have improved patient care for more than a decade. Welcome, Dr. Bryan.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you.
An absolute pleasure having you on. So, Dr. Bryan, just jumping right in, this is such an interesting field. Let's start there. What even sparked your interest in biochemistry and nitric oxide research? Where did all of this come from? And then how did you connect it all to diabetes?
Yeah, it's just like any career, it's a journey. But I've always been fascinated with science and medicine. I knew coming out of high school that I was going to pursue some degree in science or engineering. And I was at the University of Texas at Austin, where I earned a bachelor's degree in biochemistry, and then quickly realized that for me to accomplish really the goals I wanted to in life, I needed to further my education. And there I went to LSU School of Medicine, where I got a PhD in molecular and cellular physiology. And that was where I was introduced into this whole science of nitric oxide. In 1998, a Nobel Prize had just been awarded for the discovery of nitric oxide. And so we knew, the scientific and medical community knew how important this molecule was. And, I had a chance to have a conversation with one of the scientists who won the Nobel Prize for the discovery of nitric oxide. And critically important molecule, a gaseous signaling molecule, critically important, but there were still a lot of unanswered questions in the science and really the application of the science into therapeutics. So that's what originally kind of gained my interest into nitric oxide. And so, from that point on, I just delved into the science. We made a lot of discoveries and really devoted my entire academic and professional career to understanding how this molecule is produced in the human body, what goes wrong in people that can't make it, and then how do we restore the production and signaling of this critical molecule.
And this is so fascinating because you don't really think a lot about nitric oxide when you're thinking about diabetes. So help us understand. So let's just double click into that. How does nitric oxide impact metabolic health? And again, very specifically for people with diabetes.
Yeah. Well, it's a central regulator in all metabolic disease. So if you look at what we call metabolic syndrome, high blood pressure, hyperglycemia, and then hyperlipidemia. Nitric oxide controls and regulates blood pressure. It controls and regulates insulin signaling and glucose uptake. And then one of my patents is on a method of reducing triglycerides, kind of the metabolic end product of dyslipidemia. But when nitric oxide was first discovered, it was known to be a vasodilator, meaning that when it's produced in the lining of the blood vessel, it relaxes the smooth muscle. It leads to blood vessel relaxation. So we're now improving oxygen delivery and perfusion to every organ, tissue, and cell in the body. So high blood pressure, hypertension results as a consequence of insufficient nitric oxide production because we have the same volume of blood that's being pumped through constricted blood vessels, and as a result, the pressure goes up. So if we can restore normal blood nitric oxide production, then we're pumping that same volume of blood through more dilated blood vessels, and as a result, blood pressure comes down. Mechanistically, we think that nitric oxide is activating PPAR gamma and leading to lowering of triglycerides, but I think perhaps most importantly is nitric oxide, and we published on this first people to publish on this in 2009, I believe, showing that nitric oxide is part of insulin signaling. So when insulin binds to the insulin receptor, it starts a whole cascade of intracellular signaling, primarily activating AMP kinase, which is the target of metformin, the most popular anti-diabetic drug. and then also a kinase called PI3-AKT kinase. But that was really where the insulin signaling kind of stopped in terms of the terminal step is GLUT4 translocation and glucose uptake. But there was a disconnect between what happens when you activate AMP kinase or PI3-AKT kinase, and how does that lead to GLUT4 translocation and increasing glucose uptake? Well, intermediate in that signaling is nitric oxide synthase, the enzyme that produces nitric oxide. And we know in diabetics that enzyme is uncoupled and not functional. And that explains why diabetics have higher incidence of high blood pressure, neuropathy, poor wound healing, diabetic retinopathy. All the symptoms that manifest in diabetics can be explained by insufficient nitric oxide production. So our whole thought process was, well, maybe AMP kinase in these activation by insulin binding is supposed to turn on the nitric oxide production within the cell, and then nitric oxide is what post-translationally modifies GLUT4 and tells it to go to the membrane and bind glucose. And that's exactly what happens. Is if the cell is functional, when insulin binds, you get nitric oxide produced, you get GLUT4 translocation, and you get normal blood sugar regulation. But in diabetics, because they've lost the regulation of nitric oxide production because of the hyperinsulinemia, because of the hyperglycemia, this is now a feed forward perpetual system that's never corrected or interrupted until we restore the production of nitric oxide. So, if we can restore the function of the enzyme or give nitric oxide based product technology, we then activate GLUT4, we improve glucose uptake, and we potentiate insulin signaling. So, nitric oxide is the central regulator of everything we know about metabolic disease.
Okay, so I want to break this down in layman's terms. So help me understand. The nitric oxide itself, when it is found in my cells, is able to regulate the blood sugar levels better?
Absolutely. It not
And
only controls perfusion and oxygen delivery, but it's one of these signaling aspects that tells the cell to bring glucose in from the circulation and normalize it, clear it from the circulation. So now that cell can use glucose to either make glycogen and store it as an energy reserve or break it down into cellular energy, which is ATP if you have functional mitochondria. So nitric oxide is the key regulator of cellular metabolism.
okay, now this is not to be confused with like nitrous oxide, which is like the
No,
laughing
that's right.
gas and all of that. We're not talking about that, correct?
Yeah, that's N2O, nitrous oxide, the dental anesthetic. What we're talking about is NO, nitric oxide. They're both gases,
Nitric
but
oxide.
completely different physiological chemistry.
So, what does this look like? Because this sounds like incredibly important when we're talking about diabetes or even pre-diabetes for that matter. What is it about nitric oxide, and why isn't it more widely available? Why aren't doctors prescribing this? Like, help me
Yeah.
understand where the gaps are.
Well, if you look back historically, we know it takes on average about 17 years for new scientific discoveries to become standard of care. And I think that occurs because these discoveries have to stand the test of time and be able to be reproduced by other scientific groups. But the nitric oxide was first discovered in the early 80s. So now we're 40 something years past. And the reasons that it's not more widespread or a greater awareness in medical practice is despite big pharmaceutical companies trying for the past really 25 or 30 years to develop safe and effective nitric oxide based therapeutics, they failed. So there's really not a prescription that doctors can write to give a nitric oxide based drug. The other problem is because nitric oxide is a gas, it's not part of kind of standard screening and it's not part of a diagnostic. We can't draw blood and tell you what your nitric oxide levels are because when it's produced in the lining of the blood vessel, it's gone in less than a second. So it's a very unstable molecule, but once it's produced, it activates a number of signaling cascades. So we're aiming to change that. We've got a drug company called Bryan Therapeutics. We've got drugs now, a solid dose form of nitric oxide gas that were taken through the FDA in for indications like ischemic heart disease. We've got a nitric oxide drug for Alzheimer's, which again gets to the root cause of Alzheimer's. And we make a topical nitric oxide drug for diabetic ulcers. And really, the topical does really everything we need the body to do to heal a non-healing wound or diabetic ulcers. We got to get blood flow to the wound, which is what nitric oxide does. and we have to kill the infection in a lot of these diabetic and non-healing wounds. And nitric oxide is antibacterial, antiviral. Um, so it's critical in terms of regulating everything we know about the onset and progression of prediabetes, and then the development of full-blown diabetes, and then it explains all the cardiovascular complications that arise from diabetes itself.
Talk to us a little bit. So taking us back, and I know to your point around like a lot on that front hasn't been done or hasn't been done successfully by big pharma and the pharmaceutical companies in that industry yet. So let's go back a step and go into the research itself. In layman's terms, help us understand what kind of research has been done, why does it matter, and what are the impacts of that we can see even down the road.
Yep. Well, I mean, the research today in the past 40 years, have a clear understanding of how the human body makes nitric oxide. There are two primary pathways. One is through this enzyme that's found in endothelial cells. In fact, it's found in most cells throughout the body. And that production of nitric oxide through the nitric oxide synthase is what regulates second to second blood flow, regulation of blood flow to every organ, tissue, and cell in the body. It regulates things like glucose uptake. It mobilizes our own stem cells to repair and replace dysfunctional tissues. It prevents our telomeres from shortening and leading to extended in longevity and lifespan. And it activates mitochondrial biogenesis and mitochondrial efficiency of oxygen utilization. But the other way that we know nitric oxide is produced in the body is through diet. And I believe the science convinces us that the cardioprotective mechanism of things like a Japanese diet, a plant-based diet, the anti-diabetic diets, what affects diabetes and insulin resistance, can be explained by the nitric oxide that's afforded by certain diets. So this is through inorganic nitrate that's found in green leafy vegetables that's activated by the oral microbiome. And then when we swallow our saliva, we get a burst of nitric oxide gas in the lumen of the stomach. But that's dependent upon getting enough nitrate from the diet, which comes from green leafy vegetables, having the right oral microbiome. So if you're using antiseptic mouthwash or fluoride in your toothpaste, you eradicate the microbiome. And this leads to an elevation in blood pressure. It leads to metabolic syndrome. It can eventually lead to diabetes. And then the other major problem are drugs like antacids, these proton pump inhibitors, these drugs that are designed to completely inhibit stomach acid production. So if you take antacids, it completely shuts down the body's ability to make nitric oxide. Now we're seeing people who had been on proton pump inhibitors for 3 to 5 years have 40% higher incidence of Alzheimer's, heart attacks, strokes, metabolic disease. So we have to support the microbiome. We have to support stomach acid production. All of this leads to adequate nitric oxide production and disease prevention.
Interesting. And so what you're saying too, that there's like natural resources for this, but either we're not having ample or we're killing it, like you talked about mouthwash and
Okay.
other things that we're doing for. So it's really about having that healthy microbiome that can support that. Would that be a fair
No, that's
statement?
right. So we have a clear understanding in the biochemistry and the enzymology of the nitric oxide synthase enzyme. We know how to recouple it. We know how to improve endogenous nitric oxide production. And then we also know how to support through diet and microbiome and sufficient stomach acid production that leads to an adequate and sufficient nitric oxide production. So the human body is regenerative by nature. We just got to get out of the way. And so what I tell people is, stop using mouthwash. If you're using mouthwash, you have to stop. The data are very clear. It destroys the microbiome. We're informed by our physicians we shouldn't take an antibiotic every day for the rest of our life because it completely destroys the microbiome and leads to human disease, systemic disease. Well, the same thing occurs in the oral microbiome. If you're using mouthwash or if you have fluoride in your toothpaste, which most toothpaste are fluorinated, fluoride is a neurotoxin. It shuts down your thyroid function, and it's antibacterial. It's antiseptic. The reason they put it in toothpaste and municipal water supply, by the way, is because it kills the bacteria, the good bacteria and the bad bacteria. So if we stop using mouthwash, if we get rid of fluoride in our toothpaste and support the microbiome instead of trying to kill it, now the body's actually able to produce nitric oxide on its own, get off antacids, and now this enterosalivary nitric oxide production circuit is intact, and we can use diet, we can use lifestyle, moderate physical exercise, green leafy vegetables, moderate sunlight exposure. Now the body's activated and stimulating nitric oxide on its own.
That is so fascinating. And what would you say to all the dentists who are listening to this and cringing because they do want their patients to use mouthwash and they do want them to use toothpaste with fluoride in it?
Well, we're making great progress. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was in Chicago speaking before the American Dental Association because we've made a big deal out of this for probably the last 10 years. And so the dental community, there's this oral systemic link, meaning that people with advanced periodontal disease or gingivitis, poor oral hygiene, have higher incidence of heart attack, stroke, all-cause cardiovascular mortality. So the approach has been, well, let's kill the pathogens. We have to get rid of these pathogenic oral bacteria. But the collateral damage doing this, taking Listerine, scope, chlorhexidine to kill the bad bacteria, the collateral damage is actually worse than killing the pathogens because it leads to dysbiosis, disruption of nitric oxide production, and increase in heart attack, stroke, Alzheimer's. So now what we're doing with the dental community is developing technology. How do we selectively kill the oral pathogens uh, while maintaining and supporting the healthy microbiome? And that's the perfect role of nitric oxide because all pathogens are sensitive to nitric oxide. All non-pathogenic commensal bacterium don't respond to nitric oxide. In fact, they're nitric oxide producers. So we can selectively kill the pathogens while supporting the microbiome. So we're working with the dental community and we're developing a nitric oxide friendly mouthwash and a toothpaste that kills the pathogens, supports the non-pathogenic commensals, and now we've got a system to restore oral health, eradicate periodontal disease, gingivitis, caries, just by restoring the diversity of the microbiome and making sure that these bacteria can produce nitric oxide.
Lovely. And so what that would do is help us not kill it, and so it can make its way all the way through into our gut bacteria as well.
That's exactly
Now,
right.
what have and now so we talked about the research, we talked about like how it works, and what are some of the things that we are doing that we don't even realize that naturally is bringing nitric oxide into our body that we may be preventing or killing off, like we just talked about. How have some of these discoveries, so you talked about, the mouthwash, for instance, how have some of these discoveries and patents translated that you've received really translated into improved care for diabetes patients? Because I also know there's a lot of FDA clearance and all that to work through there. Can you speak to any data that you can share with us on this?
Yeah, look, we have 20 years of data, both basic science data and clinical data, and now we're developing drug technology that we're developing FDA clinical trials through. So the first thing we did was, based on my research, once we understood how the human body made nitric oxide and what goes wrong in people that can't make it, we developed an orally disintegrating tablet that if your body can't make nitric oxide, then we have to do it for you, right? And we published in 2007 that nitric oxide is a hormone. So similar to hormone replacement therapy, the best example is testosterone in men or estrogen in women. If you're low in testosterone, you're a man, we can replace that hormone simply by giving you testosterone. We don't give you DHA or precursors and hope your body can make testosterone out of it because that's the basis of your deficiency. So same thing, we have to give the actual bioactive molecule, nitric oxide. So we do this through an orally disintegrating tablet. You put it in your mouth, it dissolves over 5 to 6 minutes, and we're liberating nitric oxide. It's vasoactive. We can see dilation of the carotid arteries within 10, 12 seconds. We improve insulin signaling, improve glucose uptake, and we restore the function of the enzyme in the lining of the blood vessels. And because this lozenge sits on the dorsal part of the tongue, it selectively kills the pathogens and it improves the diversity of these nitric oxide producing bacteria. So if your body can't make nitric oxide, this technology does it for you, and it improves the body's ability to make it on its own. So that's the science of, and this is registered as a dietary supplement. So it's intended to support the structure and function of the body and maintain and support normal nitric oxide production. The drug therapy we're developing is very similar technology. It's just a higher dose, a higher potency, because supplements really are just designed to supplement or restore physiological levels. What drugs are designed to do is number one, be safe, but number two, be efficacious in different clinical indications. So, and we published on this, the lozenge and showing that we can normalize blood pressure, we can enhance exercise performance, we can lower triglycerides, We published a paper in 2011 showing that a 15-year-old kid with resistant hypertension, kidney disease, heart disease, where no prescription medication was affecting his disease, we gave him our nitric oxide lozenge. We normalized his blood pressure. We got him off all prescription medication. His kidney disease resolved within 5 days. His heart disease resolved within 5 months. So when all other medications had failed this kid, the nitric oxide generating lozenge completely saved his life and reversed his metabolic disease.
That is so extremely powerful to hear about. So help me understand, are there side effects to this? This is something that we hear about in pharma all the time, about all the you solve one problem but you take on like seven others. What are the side effects? What should we know about here?
Well, there are none. And let me make a very clear point here. At our company, Bryan Therapeutics, most drugs are using pharmacology, meaning that you synthesize a compound that inhibits a biochemical reaction. And that's pharmacology. And when you do that, there's always consequences. And those consequences are called side effects. Our drug discovery is based on physiology. And we call this restorative physiology. So we're never introducing a foreign compound or a synthetic compound that's inhibiting a biochemical reaction. What we do is restorative. Nitric oxide is a molecule that's naturally produced in the body. It declines with age, and that's what leads to age-related disease. So what we do is very similar to if you go and draw your blood and you've got a vitamin D level of 30 and we need it to be 80, what do? We give you vitamin D to restore normal physiological levels. And that's what we do that no one else has been able to do is we give you nitric oxide to normalize your levels. And this is called restorative physiology. And when you understand how much nitric oxide is produced, where it goes, what it becomes, and how it signals, then we can recapitulate that through this lozenge. And so when you give the body what it needs to restore normal production, there are no side effects. What are the side effects? Well, we see better blood pressure control. We see better energy. We see better sexual function. We see better management of blood glucose and insulin signaling. We see mobilization of stem cells so you can repair and replace dysfunctional cells and get rid of these senescent zombie type cells. Those are the side effects. But dose dictates poison. If you take too much nitric oxide, the consequences are a low blood pressure, what we call hypotension, or a condition called methemoglobinemia, where you oxidize the iron of red blood cells and hemoglobin and reduce the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. But at the doses that we deliver through our product technology in the supplement space and even in drug therapy, you don't see an unsafe drop in blood pressure, and you certainly don't see any methemoglobin formation. So it's safe and efficacious.
And how would I know? So you said it's not like blood work where I can go in and I can,
Yeah.
I can tell if my nitric oxide is low. What are the symptoms? How would someone find out?
Well, we have to rely on symptoms. So the first sign and symptom of nitric oxide deficiency is sexual dysfunction. If you can't dilate the blood vessels of the sex organs because you can't make nitric oxide, then you develop ED. That occurs in both men and women. Next, your blood pressure starts to increase. If you lose the vasodilatory effects of nitric oxide, now your blood pressure is going to go up. 2 out of 3 Americans have an unsafe elevation of blood pressure. Number three, you start to develop metabolic disease, diabetes. If it's not corrected, then you develop exercise intolerance because if you can't dilate the blood vessels of the coronary arteries when you start to exercise, you get short of breath, you get changes in electrical activity, and that's diagnostic for heart disease. And then later on, if you start to develop mild cognitive disorders, dementia, and Alzheimer's, then that's a symptom of nitric oxide deficiency. So there's a hierarchy of things that happen, but we have to listen to our body. Our body tells us that things aren't right. If we have erectile dysfunction, if we have diabetes, that's a problem and we need to address it. But we need to understand the signaling and the mechanism of action which leads to those diseases so we can get to the root cause. And in most cases, it's a lack of nitric oxide production. Now, it's not a panacea, it's not an end all be all cure all. You still got to reduce sugar intake, you still got to exercise, but nothing is going to work. Metformin will not work unless we restore the production of nitric oxide.
Would you say that nitric oxide becomes a last resort? Like, where does it fall in diabetes care eventually? Like, where would it fall within the metformin and all the other medications and everything that one takes? Yeah, where would it fall within that?
Well, it's foundational. It should be the first step because Metformin, if you activate AMP kinase, but the cell can't make nitric oxide, you're not going to get glucose uptake. So activation of AMP kinase is dependent upon nitric oxide production. But if you look at diets, I mean, diabetes is completely preventable, treatable, reversible, and curable with diet and lifestyle. And we understand mechanistically why diet, why lifestyle overcomes diabetes. It's because it activates nitric oxide production, potentiates insulin signaling, and improves glucose uptake. But if your body can't make nitric oxide, then diet's not going to work, exercise isn't going to work, drug therapy is not going to work. So it's foundational. You have to start at nitric oxide and then start to implement dietary lifestyle changes, even drug therapy like metformin or other anti-diabetic drugs. But nitric oxide should be the first stop.
That's helpful. I know we're coming toward the close of this episode. Dr. Bryan, thank you so very much for going through this. Help us understand how our listeners can connect with you, learn more about your work. I know you talked about the supplement earlier as well. What are the types of things we can look for from your company or even outside with other collaborations like you mentioned? Give us sort of some line of sight into that and how folks can connect with you.
Yeah, well, I send people to my YouTube channel. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. It's Dr. Nathan S. Bryan Nitric Oxide, where we provide really education. I'm not here to sell you products. I'm here to provide awareness and education, so patients and consumers and even physicians can make educated choices and decisions on what's best for their individual health or their patients. I've got an educational website, Dr. Nathan S. Bryan. I'm on social media. My new Instagram is the real Dr. Nathan S. Bryan. My other account was hacked, so I've lost control of that. For product technology, it's n101.com, the letter N, the number one, the letter O, number one.com. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter, or now X, at Dr. Nitric. You can find me on PubMed. Look at our published scientific papers in the peer-reviewed literature. So I'm searchable by most search engines. So just get educated, get informed, so you can make educated, informed decisions.
Okay, this is incredibly helpful, Dr. Bryan. Thank you so much again. I feel like there can be a whole another episode and like just diving really deep into this and really getting into sort of the heart of even other conditions. We barely just scraped the surface on diabetes, but thank you so very much. And to our listeners, thank you for listening to another episode of the Yumlish podcast. We will now head over to our social media so you can find us at Yumlish, on Instagram or even on Facebook, and help us understand how could the insights from this episode influence your diabetes management or that of someone you care for. So again, head over to @Yumlish on Facebook, on Instagram, find this podcast post and comment below again to tell us how could the insights from this episode influence your diabetes management or that of someone you care for. We'll continue the conversation there. Dr. Bryan, thank you again.
Thank you.